name is Keith Beavers. I'm just giving the cat some treats. So, because I mean, like, these guys are gonna do cameos. I got 3 cats. Okay. Screaming Eagle. What is going on? This wine is, if not the most expensive wine in America, made in America, one of the most expensive wines made in America. And I gotta say, you know, when you hear the term Screaming Eagle and you're a wine person who likes wine, you immediately go to the term cult cab. Screaming Eagle has always been associated with the cult cab era of California wine. But the thing is, I went into the research of this wine with an idea, a cult cab idea. And as I researched this wine, a whole different mindset just kind of like shifted. Is that how you say it? In my brain. I just shifted. And then I realized I've actually had Screaming Eagle. It was a long time ago, but I've actually had it. And I remember where I was, and I remember the wine. And as I researched these wines, or this wine, and then I read some of the tasting notes from Karen McNeil from the 2015 vintage, I kind of remember exactly what she says. I remember. And what I remember is not a cult cab or the cult cabs that we think are cult cabs. Let me explain. The story of Screaming Eagle is one of the most unique American wine stories in the history of American wine. I have studied American wine, the story of American wine, from Virginia, James River, Virginia, all the way to Sonoma and beyond. And there are so many cool stories in wine, humans doing really cool stuff. This one is very unique. And what's cool about it is it's wrapped in mystery. Not like, it's hard to explain. We'll get into it, but this is a very cool story about American wine. The unique thing about researching these wines is that the United States is pretty young, and all these stories, they're not like in books. I mean, I'm sure they are, but like the minutia, like the small details of these stories of American wine, these iconic American wines, are found by scouring the internet, looking for interviews, finding little pieces of information. It's a very different kind of research than the research that I've been doing in the history of this podcast. And it's cool. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, as we embark on this journey, these American wines, and as I tell these stories, I'm going to tell you these stories based on the information that I'm getting. And I'm going to tell these stories based on what I found. In 1958, Richard Peterson gets a job at Ernest & Gallo. He was a graduate from Iowa University majoring in chemical engineering. This begins the Screaming Eagle story. What's cool about Richard Peterson is he has a memoir called The Winemaker. I have not read it and I really want to read it, but I read an interview with him about it and he's seen a lot of stuff. Richard Peterson is one of those humans in California wine history who was a witness to post-Prohibition California, getting a job at Gallo, watching what people had to do to make money. It's all in the memoir, apparently, and the interview is pretty amazing if you can get into it. It's at schaefervineyards.com, I believe. After being part of the Ernest & Gallo team, he then goes and works for Below Vineyards. Now, Below Vineyards is a very important winery in the history of American wine, especially California wine. And Andrei Chelichev was heading that venture. Andrei Chelichev is one of the most important, one of the most famous wine consulting winemakers in the history of California. And Richard Peterson had the chance to work with him, which is amazing. After Richard Peterson leaves like the job market, if you will, he becomes a wine consultant. And with his background, he's pretty well known. So Richard Peterson lives in Modesto, California, because that is where Gallo is based. He then moves to Napa because that's where Below Vineyards is based. Before he moves to Napa, he has a family, and his daughter goes to grade school in Modesto, and then she goes to high school in Napa, and then she ends up graduating high school, and her dad's a wine person, so Heidi gets into wine. She goes to UC Davis. She graduates from UC Davis in 1980 with a Bachelor of Science in Fermentation Science. She's also one of 4 women in her graduating class of 30. As we have established on Wine 101, the 1980s in Napa was a very heady, exciting time. In 1981, Napa Valley becomes an AVA, and you can only imagine the excitement going on in the valley at that time. This is where Jean Phillips enters the story. She was a realtor in Napa Valley. Now imagine being a realtor in Napa Valley in the 80s when everyone's rushing in to buy land and start vineyards. Jean Phillips had connections. She knew families, she knew properties. This was her job. So Jean Phillips is helping people find land in Napa Valley. One of her clients is Gustave Dellavalle. Put a pin in that for a second. The thing about Jean Phillips is she's bopping around the valley. She's helping people buy up vineyards and properties. She's seeing how feverish it is in Napa. And she decides she wants to purchase land as well. So she becomes a former realtor. So Jean Phillips wasn't a winemaker, but she was a realtor, so she understood the land of the Napa Valley. She ends up buying a 57-acre vineyard. It was mixed plantings. Again, at this time, this is like post-prohibition. The wine scene hadn't really popped off yet. It was like in the middle of popping off, and like there were still vineyards laying around of mixed vines. So she buys 57 acres of it. She ends up selling a lot of the grapes and vines to other winemakers, reserving 1 acre for herself of Cabernet Sauvignon. She then starts going around to Mondavi employees and asking them if this vineyard could make good wine. So the advice from the Gallo employees was probably pretty good because she ends up hiring Richard Peterson as a wine consultant for this vineyard she has. And speaking of Richard Peterson, his daughter Heidi, who was at Buehler Vineyards in 1983, 5 years later decides to break out on her own, follow in her father's footsteps, and become a wine consultant. Heidi's first consulting gig is at Dellavalle, Gustave Dellavalle, the same winery that Jean Phillips had helped acquire for Gustave. So Heidi Peterson, or Heidi Barrett, I'm not really sure when Heidi got married, but at some point Heidi marries the CEO of Chateau Montelena, Beau Barrett, and she is making wine with Gustave Dellavalle as a consultant, and through that consultation, she makes 2 100-point wines awarded by Robert Parker, or I should say the Wine Advocate. Now, between Heidi Barrett working with Gustave and what happens next, I'm not really sure how the chronology works out, but I know that at some point, Richard Peterson introduces Heidi to Jean Phillips, and they become friends. And then Jean Phillips hires Heidi Barrett on an hourly basis to help her make wine from her Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard. So you have this really cool situation here. You have Jean Phillips and her small plot of land with a dream. And then you have Heidi Barrett helping her friend make wine. And it was all just kind of serendipitous, I guess. There's a really great story by Jancis Robinson. I think she wrote an article in the Oxford Wine Companion or jancisrobinson.com in, I think, 2007. It's a recounting of her and a team going to the Napa Valley to scout locations for a BBC series they were doing. And Jean Phillips happened to be the person helping them connect with all the people they needed to connect with, which is pretty cool. At some point, they end up back at her ranch house. And this is after she had bought the property. And they're hanging out at the ranch house, and they look down on this little bowl of a vineyard. And she points over to the winery, which is this little building, and she says, "That's where my friend Heidi is making a wine for me, a little project that I'm doing." And the thing is, years later, after Jancis, years after that broadcast series was that series was broadcast, she put two and two together that Gene Phillips is the person that actually is the owner of Screaming Eagle. And she also says that she should have known it from her email, because her email at the time was, I think, Screamin' Gene. It's pretty amazing stuff. So with her 1 acre of land, I mean, she had the other acres for, people were still buying, I believe, still buying fruit from. But with her 1 acre of Cabernet Sauvignon and her friend Heidi making wine for her, 1992, they release their first vintage. The name of the wine, the name of the brand is called Screaming Eagle. There's really no information as to why that's called Screaming Eagle, because Gene Phillips doesn't do interviews. She never really did interviews. There's actually not a lot of photos of her on the internet. Can't really find much about her. There is an indication from Karen McNeil in an article she wrote saying that the 101st Airborne Division of the Army was an experimental elite paratrooping force during World War II. They were called the Screaming Eagles. And what's really wild about this particular group of people, because it was experimental, it was expected to experience up to at least 80% casualties. They never experienced one casualty. Now, there's no real story beyond that, other than Gene Phillips said the name means something to her, or meant a lot to her. So we don't know, maybe she had a relative that was in that particular division. I don't really know, but Screaming Eagle makes complete sense. I mean, America. So in 1995, the 1992 vintage gets 99 points from Robert Parker's Wine Advocate. That is it. Because at this point in California, an American wine, Robert Parker in the 90s had his hold on the wine industry, not just the United States, but the world. People were making wines so that Robert Parker would like them, not Heidi Barrett. Heidi Barrett was making wine the way she wanted to make it with her friend Gene Phillips. And the result was apparently a stunning wine. And at this time, this is like not even is it a decade? Like a little over a decade after it becomes an AVA. This blew up. And that's the true history of Screaming Eagle. Just like a lot of wine stories in the United States, there are these humble beginnings. And then things just changed dramatically. So after 1995, Screaming Eagle establishes itself as a brand. And from then until the new millennium, they built and built and built. The thing is, though, Gene Phillips is not a winemaker. And around the turn of the millennium, she realized that there's some upkeep that needed to happen on her property. She needed some renovations. The vineyard, unfortunately, her Cabernet vineyard was experiencing a virus of leaf roll. And that leaf roll was moving into neighboring vineyards. And she knew she was going to have to spend a lot of money to kind of replant or do something to fix this virus and renovate things she needed to renovate. But she was kind of at a turning point in her life. In 2003, a guy by the name of Stan Kroenke, who owns Arsenal Club, it's football, football, the St. Louis Rams and the Denver Nuggets. He's approached by, or I don't know if his money manager is Charles Banks, but Charles Banks is a guy who manages money for famous athletes. He convinces Stan to diversify his portfolio and get into wine. So Stan takes him up on this offer, goes out to California and starts looking for vineyards. Now, the story goes he was in Santa Barbara trying to establish something. It makes sense. It's just north of LA. I mean, it makes sense. But while he was in Santa Barbara, someone's like, you should go up to Oakville. There's somebody I know named Gene Phillips, and she might want to sell her property, and you might want to take a look at it. And just like the serendipitous meeting between Gene Phillips and Heidi Barrett, she had another serendipitous meeting with Stan Kroenke and Charles Banks. Because just as she was thinking about basically selling Screaming Eagle, they were like, we're going to buy all of this and we can do all the work that you are about to endure. And she said yes. Now, at the time, she had originally bought 57 acres. From what I'm reading, it was now 54 acres. And this is a very interesting moment, a bit of a turning point here, because the thing is, Heidi Barrett is credited with ushering in the cult cab era. And cult cabs would eventually become known as just big, huge, opaque, full-bodied red wine with higher alcohol contents. And this is what's interesting. When Charles Banks and Stan Kroenke, now in a partnership, purchase Screaming Eagle, one thing that Stan says is very interesting. He says, I'm not a fan of the current state of Cabernet Sauvignon. I'm paraphrasing. The current state of Cabernet Sauvignon. He said that they're heavy, they're big, and they're very port-like. And he said, I don't want to make wines like that. Interesting. But this is how the Screaming Eagle we know today happened. I just said that. That, the Screaming Eagle we know today. We don't really know Screaming Eagle because almost nobody has had any of it. It goes into auction. It sometimes doesn't even get consumed. Critics try it. I've tried it once in my life, but I guess I should say the Screaming Eagle that we know in theory, as in we know about the brand. So this is when Screaming Eagle, I guess, enters its modern era. It's hard to say that, but like there was a moment before and a moment after for this brand. The moment before was during the heady time of Napa when everything was getting exciting and then transitioned into the cult cab movement. After the purchase, it enters kind of a new life, and it's not necessarily about the cult cab movement. And I'm not necessarily sure Screaming Eagle was ever a cult cab, other than the fact that it was highly allocated and not a lot of it was made. I think originally it was like 500 to 600 cases. To this day, it's like 600 or 700 cases. So it's a still small production. So there's new ownership at Screaming Eagle. It's no longer the humble beginnings of a former realtor and her friend. It is now a powerhouse owned by two very wealthy people. So what do? They change a lot of stuff. They don't really change stuff. They just start to improve. So they go about the business of modernizing or improving this property. They inoculated the soil against leaf roll. They planted new rootstock. They reoriented the rows so that the sun gets both sides of the trellis. They increased plantings of Cab Franc because that was Charles Banks' favorite, and they sacrificed a bunch of Merlot for that, but they kept Cabernet Sauvignon as the mainstay. They began to work organically. They also started planting higher proportions to add more wine to the Screaming Eagle line. Gene's house was torn down to build a winery, and they hired a completely new winemaking team. Andy Erickson from Harlan and his wife, Annie Favia, French enologist Michel Roland, that's serious stuff, and well-known viticulturist David Arbeau. Andy Erickson came from across the street, because right across the street from Screaming Eagle is Harlan Estates. Nowadays, when you go on the Screaming Eagle site, it's just a black screen with some words and links on it. And it's very hard to get on the mailing list. It's all allocated. It's very, very expensive. And I don't know if that was happening when Gene Phillips was around or if this was exclusively happening when these two guys took it over, but they built and maintained a very luxury brand. In 2009, they split up. Charles Banks was convicted of wire fraud. So it's just Stan. So Stan Kroenke owns Screaming Eagle. His winemaker is Andy Erickson. And Andy Erickson ends up hiring an assistant winemaker from across the street at Harlan where he used to work. So in 2010, Nick Gislason becomes the assistant winemaker under Andy Erickson at Screaming Eagle. That next vintage, Andy pieces out, leaving Nick as the head winemaker. And that's basically where we're at today. So today what Screaming Eagle is a low yielding, allocated, very expensive wine. And the winemaking process is not, I mean, it's unique, but it's kind of in line with what we're seeing today. Because what Nick does is he has 50 blocks within the Screaming Eagle vineyard. He harvests and vinifies each block separately. He actually farms each block separately. Then in the winery, each block is vinified in one of 4 or types of vessels, something like that. You have oak, stainless steel, concrete. I can't remember if there's another one, but he basically decides every vintage which wine goes into what. So every block is vinified separately, and then it's blended. Also, talk about sustainability. There are sheep in the vineyard eating all the weeds and fertilizing the vineyard. So it's very much in line with all the sustainability we're seeing today. I think what is kind of cool about Screaming Eagle is the mystery. It's not mysterious, but Gene Phillips was a bit of a mystery. And not a lot of people have tasted Screaming Eagle, and they don't honor interviews or appointments. It's just like this mysterious thing. And what's even more mysterious is the winemaker, Nick, says only about a quarter to a third of the vineyard makes it in to Screaming Eagle. When asked where the remainder goes, he says it disappears. No information as to where it goes. Personally, I think I'd be drinking it myself, right? Also, what I find interesting is, like, I'm not sure this is a cult wine or a cult cab it's a cult wine because not a lot of people get it, I guess, but it's not a cult. I guess it's a cult cab, but if cult cab is defined by almost opaque, high alcohol wines, the Screaming Eagle has like high alcohol because it's Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's not big and full. The one that I had years ago that I'll never forget, now that I remember drinking it, was at a steakhouse in Virginia. And I remember the wine being typical California. I remember, and this is a long time ago, I was just getting into wine. And I remember like the whole pencil shaving thing came about. But what I noticed with the Screaming Eagle when I tried it was not heavy. It was not kick you in the teeth. It had a lightness to it. There was this acidity and this softness of fruit that was almost elegant. It was almost like the elegance of the most elegant Bordeaux, but without the ornery tannins. Like, it was soft. And I'm not really, structured, but soft. And I'm just not sure that's what defines cult cabs. Anyway, it kind of started the whole idea of a Cabernet Sauvignon at such a small allocation. And what was really cool about these guys, Charles and Stan, is when they came on board, they didn't want to do the vanity project. And one of the reasons why Gene Phillips actually sold to them is because they said, we don't want to do the vanity project. We want to create or maintain your legacy. And this is what they're doing. So, is this wine worth it? I don't know. Is it worth it to you? Would you spend over $1,000 on a bottle of American Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon? Would you spend $1,000 on a Bordeaux? Would you spend $1,000 on a Burgundy? Would you spend $1,000 on a Champagne? It's kind of the same thing. Screaming Eagle is part of our kind of luxury high-end story. And it goes to show, like, Napa Valley is truly America's, this is what I think, is truly America's fine wine region. And this little bowl of Cabernet Sauvignon that's been cared for since 1986, in the small production of it, it kind of harkens back to the clos and climat of Burgundy. It also harkens back to the small plots of land that made Bordeaux famous. So I personally don't think over $1,000 is something I would spend on wine. It just doesn't make sense. But I guess if we're in the framework of fine wine that can be auctioned off, then I think it's worth the price if you can get it. So in the end, it's really up to you. If you believe something like Screaming Eagle is worth it, the story's pretty amazing, but that's how you wine 101 Screaming Eagle. Let's talk next week.